So feminist exegesis really is reading texts with the modern idea that women are people and the knowledge that women's voices and interests have often been suppressed, including in biblical literature. So for most of the Bible's history, the people who were reading, and not only reading, but telling everybody else how to read, most of those people have been men. So whether that is the ancient rabbis, the church fathers, early biblical scholars in the 19th century, most of those people were dudes. So feminist exegesis, I think, offers a corrective to that, both the fact that the texts themselves are more than likely mostly written by men, and the fact that the history of interpretation has mostly been male. So feminist exegesis is often asking either what happens when a woman reads this text, or what happens when anyone of any gender reads this text with an idea toward recovering women's lives and stories and toward privileging women's lives and stories.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Caryn Tamber-Rosenau. She teaches here in Houston at the University of Houston, and so this was fun to have somebody so nearby. I prefer to do interviews remotely, but it's nice to know talking to somebody in the same city. I feel like I don't get to do that enough. If you have any guest suggestions or feedback, or you just want to reach out and chat, please do so at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com, all one word. Itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. I'm going to keep this one short. There's not a lot to say that I don't think listening to the interview itself will not give you. So here's my conversation with Caryn Tamber-Rosenau. Caryn Tamber-Rosenau, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I am an assistant professor of Jewish studies and religious studies at the University of Houston, and I also direct our Jewish studies program here. I am a scholar of the Hebrew Bible and Second Temple Jewish literature, and I specialize in studying women, gender, and sexuality in those texts.
Okay. I know I didn't send you this question, but my actual first question is going to be, whose house?
Coog's house.
Okay. Yeah, so just for the listeners, some college is from that institution, the University of Houston. So I was a little, you know what? I was a little bit worried, not giving you a heads up. Like, I don't know, maybe she won't answer it right, but you did. So,
all right, we nailed it.
Yeah. So now we'll move on to the actual interview. We're going to be discussing your article from the Journal of Biblical Literature, Embracing the Jewess, Reading Gender and Ethnicity in Judith with Belle-Juive?
The Belle-Juive.
The right. Belle-Juive. Okay.
Belle-Juive, yes.
Okay. Can we start out? What is Judith as a book? Can you walk us through what that is?
Yes, it's one of my favorite topics. So Judith is a book of the Apocrypha, which means it was written by Jews for Jews as holy text in an ancient Jewish context, probably around the 2nd century BCE. But for one reason or another, it does not actually make it into the Jewish canon, but it is circulated with the Septuagint, so the early Greek and early Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, right? So it circulates there, and it is actually adopted into the Christian canon when Christians take, all of the Hebrew scriptures translated into Greek that are in the Septuagint and make them part of Christian Holy Scripture as well. Judith is included in that, along with other texts like Ben Sira and Maccabees, Tobit, other things that listeners might have heard of. So it's Apocrypha. So it's not canon for Jews. It was canon for Christians for a very long time, and it was essentially kind of bounced from the canon, relegated to appendix at around the time of the Protestant Reformation, because some of the reformers felt, well, it was never Jewish scripture. We don't like it either. We don't think it should be in our Bible. So for Protestants today and for Jews, it is not Bible. For Catholics and Orthodox Christians, it is. So depending on where listeners are coming from, they may or may not actually have this text in their Bible. So you want me to tell you a little bit about the story?
Absolutely. I want you to
Okay.
say whatever you want.
Okay. So for people who are not familiar with the story of Judith, it's so the book is called Judith, but Judith actually doesn't appear until chapter 8, which is kind of strange. The story opens with the Assyrian Empire wanting to basically conquer all of the Levant. And they are laying siege to various places, including to this town called Bethulia, which is an Israelite town, and it is they're laying in their defenses to try to resist the Assyrians, and um, they start basically starving in the streets because they're being starved out. They're dying of thirst. It's really terrible. And that's where we get Judith. And so Judith is introduced in chapter 8, and she is a resident of this town called Bethulia. She is an Israelite woman. Her name actually means Jewess or Jewish woman, right? Judith. It's the feminine version of the name Judah. And Judith is introduced as this beautiful, pious, clever, righteous widow. And she comes in and she takes the elders of the town to task because she says, "You're thinking of maybe surrendering to the Assyrians? How can you even think of doing that? You're basically putting God to the test, and I don't like that. I don't think that's proper. Just wait. God, trust that God will make a miracle for us." And they're like, "No, you silly woman, just go pray about it or something." And she's like, "You know what, guys? I'm going to do something and it's going to be amazing. And I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm not going to tell you what my plans are at all. All I'm asking is that when I want to go out tonight, open the city gates and let me out." So the guys are like, "Fine, whatever, Judith." She takes a bath, takes off all her widow's clothing, puts on all of her beautiful, expensive clothing, does her hair, puts on a tiara, anoints herself, puts on beautiful shoes, all her jewelry, and she takes a maidservant with her. She takes some food with her, and they leave the city. And they go into the Assyrian camp where all the soldiers are encamped waiting to starve out her people. And they get there, and she says, "All right, take me to your general, Holofernes. Take me right to Holofernes." And she tells Holofernes, "I am defecting because I know that you're going to be able to conquer my people, and I want to help you do that." And he completely falls for it. She spends a few days in the camp. And at the end of a few days, he starts thinking, well, maybe I should try something with this lady. And he invites her to come drink with him. And she goes to a drinking party in his tent. It's just the two of them. He gets so excited about the prospect of finally getting to sleep with this woman that he gets more drunk than he's ever been in his entire life. He passes out dead drunk on his bed. She takes the sword from above his bed, beheads him with his own sword, carries his head back to her city in her food bag with her maid. She manages to tell the people of her city, "You need to hang this head on the city wall. It will really freak out the Assyrians and they'll scatter in terror." This is what happens. They scatter in terror. The people of Bethulia are able to cut them down as they're fleeing in terror, and nobody bothers them for a very long time afterward. And Judith receives all these proposals of marriage from all of the different men in the town, but she refuses all of them, lives out the rest of her days as a widow, and dies at the ripe old age of 105.
Okay, quite the story.
It is quite the story.
And so you say in your article that your analysis is a literary analysis in distinction to other types, and if you want to address what those are, that's up to you. I don't want to try to frame it that way. What do you mean by a literary analysis? And if you have to distinguish it against something, that's fine.
Sure. So I distinguish it against a historical critical reading. So a historical critical reading is aiming to uncover in some fashion what is the history behind the text? What are the real events behind the text, if any? What's the authorship? What's the dating? What's the provenance? Where was this written, etc.? So the questions you ask in historical criticism, what I tell my students is these are the questions you would ask in any history class. What happened, when, who, what, when, right? Literary critical readings are different, and they ask about how the text functions as a text. What's the plot here? How are the characters developed? There's a really interesting word that's used in this particular verse. Why is this word here and not another word that means almost the same thing that's much more common? So these are the questions often that you would ask in an English literature class. Questions about historicity and the historical truth value behind the text are often, but not always, beside the point for literary criticism. So when I do literary criticism, I'm not completely agnostic. I'm not totally unconcerned with the historical circumstances, but they're just not my main focus. I want to see how the text works as a text and how we can read it, even if those readings are not the ones that would have been intended by an original author or the ones received by an original audience. I want to play with the text as we have it to see what we can do with it.
So, in a way, it's okay for a reader, interpreter, however you want to characterize that, to be a little bit offset from the author. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. So I think that we can, when we consider meaning and how meaning is transmitted and how meaning is received, right? We don't want to necessarily see that the author is coming up with one particular meaning, and then that meaning is going to get transmitted to their intended audience exactly as they meant it, and like we can't get anything else from it, right? I think that's really limiting, both because I think authors rarely have one meaning. I think original audiences rarely get one meaning, a single meaning out of a text. And I think we are not the original audience, right? We are working so far from the original compositional circumstances that I think it's almost irresponsible not to consider what how we can read it today, right? Because if especially because the Bible is one of these texts that people do want to read in our own time, in their own time. And so what can we do with it, right? It's still a live text. It's still a text that people are reading with all sorts of aims and goals and interests. And so it is important to look at what we can derive from it now.
I think even the idea, though, that you're respecting or sticking to an original intent, I don't know, to me it creates a kind of like fractal anxiety, because uh, handing down an original intent has to come through the filter of contemporary understanding, which is going to change what that means. And I think, with as with any other biblical text, people are engaging it for multiple different reasons. This one, I think, statistically in the United States, most Christians probably aren't going to be dealing with it. But I think it is instructive to kind of take something. As I was reading, I was realizing the helpful thing for people who this may not be included in their Bible, is to see that a similar analysis could be applied to something like Ruth, a similar, or any particular book, but to acknowledge this instance of engaging with a biblical text is intended to be liturgical. This one is intended to be devotional. This one is intended to be literary or academic or historical critical. And thus, look, my brain is roundabout. Listeners have probably figured that out, but the guests almost never know me, so they have no reason to understand why I'm rambling. But that is where this, I think, device, maybe there's a better term for it, of the Belge. I'm probably going to keep saying that wrong.
No, you said it right. You're
Yeah,
good.
okay. I'm going to forget how to say it then. That how where that comes in, is that fair to say?
Yeah, I do think that, yeah, absolutely. If it's true that a lot of the majority of Christians, who are not Catholic or Orthodox, right, Protestant Christians, are not generally going to be engaging in this from a faith perspective. But if this is an object lesson in why this is useful, fruitful for other texts that people may be encountering in a faith context, that's great. So much better.
or just literary. I mean, that's fine. Like
Yes.
everyone's this is America. Everyone's allowed to read whatever they want.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what is the origin of the Belgeweave?
Sure. So this Belgeweave idea, the first time we see it really is in the medieval period, and I think these depictions of the Belgeweave are really they really are, for the most part, they are depictions by Christian men of Jewish women. And they're really born out of these fantasies and fears, kind of twinned fantasies and fears that Christian men might have had about Jewish women. So, in general, I think in the medieval period and the early modern period, the Jew was a target of suspicion, pity, or even loathing or hatred by Christians. And when I say the Jew, I think the Jew was typically gendered male, right? And just like most groups, I think most stereotypes, when we stereotype groups, we tend to stereotype them as male. If you do a Google search for, basically any kind of ethnicity or identity, and you don't include a gender qualifier there, you're probably going to get men. And I don't think that's unique to our modern age. I do think that the Jew is gendered as masculine, but often like deficiently masculine. So the manliness of the Jewish man was often suspect in comparison to Christian manliness. And in many ways, the body of the Jewish man, as a lot of people who work on, medieval and early modern Jewish thought have pointed out, in many ways, that body of the Jewish man was often feminized. So where that left Jewish women was really interesting. So you had this Jewish man who was this target of a lot of suspicion, a lot of hostility, but Christian men then noticed Jewish women, and I think that this was an issue of some of these men noticing they were actually attracted to the wives or sisters or daughters of the men who they considered suspicious or blameworthy, the Christ killer accusation, or, any of the usury accusations, things like that. So when they noticed that they were actually attracted to some of these women, I think that kind of freaked them out. So the Belgeweave figure is really an attempt to deal with an attraction that both scared them and drew them in at the same time. So there's this attraction and revulsion at the same time. Like, she's a woman, but she's Jewish, and there was this the revulsion of Jewish men. So like, what do we do with Jewish women? And I think the Belgeweave figure really emerges out of that tension between the gender thing and the Jewishness thing.
And if correct me if I'm wrong, but there are two characters that are mentioned in your article, Judith being one, Salome being the other, that represent this trope type, whatever.
Yeah, well, so these two biblical women who are often depicted as the Belgeweave, or like seen as kind of forerunners or archetypes of the Belgeweave. And then you have these other really famous figures that are, de novo in the medieval or Renaissance period, like Jessica from the Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, or Rebecca from Ivanhoe. So there are a variety of these figures, but yeah, there's, when it comes to the biblical, I think these figures of Salome and Judith are the two that stand out.
So you mentioned a Rebecca, and I don't care how ham-handed it is. I'm going to shoehorn it in here because I think I would be remiss if I didn't take the opportunity to talk about Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. Rachel Bloom's character, Rebecca Bunch, is mentioned. What is the relevance, like jumping to a modern character, to the article overall?
Sure. So I don't want to speak too outside of my area of expertise. And I do want to shout out a couple of scholars who have written on Jewishness and gender in Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, Jenny Kaplan and Samantha Pickett. But yeah, I mean, I do love me some Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. So, I mean, you had asked me in an email before recording, like, is this an instance? Is Rachel Bloom's character Rebecca Bunch an instance of the Belle Juive? And so, I don't think it's quite that simple. There are some instances of the Belle Juive, some citations of the Belle Juive archetype that are produced by Jewish men, but I'm not sure if we can speak in the same terms about art that's created by a Jewish woman. And I think we want to foreground the role of Rachel Bloom here as, she's the creative force behind Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. She's doing the producing, the writing, and she's starring, right? And so I do think that there is a little bit of a different valence here. I think there's a lot of interesting things to say about gender and Jewishness, again, that Jenny and Samantha have both worked on. But I'm not sure that I would call this a Belle Juive figure, because the Belle Juive really was, I do think, a depiction from the outside. It was a quest to try to deal with the complications of femaleness and Jewishness by people who were neither, typically. And if so, it was really exoticizing, it was orientalizing, and I don't think we can quite get the same thing from somebody who is a member of, she's both Jewish and female. But that said, there's certainly a whole lot that you can say, and people who are way more knowledgeable about pop culture than I have said some of it about Crazy Ex-Girlfriend and gender and Jewishness.
I think the reason that stood out to me, well, one, I love Rachel Bloom. The only thing I don't like about her is her hot take on Kurt Vonnegut, which is a really deep cut. But
I don't think I've seen it, but okay.
Well, it's more buried in her take on Ray Bradbury.
Okay.
But so there's a YouTube channel called Cinema Therapy, and it's a filmmaker and a licensed therapist, and they break down films, and they looked at Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, and they have an episode where they're evaluating relationships and the perspective of Rebecca, and they kind of mentioned, they don't use, this is my way of paraphrasing, there's a kind of reappropriation of the theater kid trope in there, and I wondered if there may be an attempt by her as a Jewish woman to maybe reappropriate that, and we don't have to camp out there. That's just, I'm just saying that by way of explaining. I didn't just bring it up because I love Rachel Bloom. I love Rachel Bloom, and I'm bringing it up because I wondered if maybe there was a layer there that I hadn't picked up on. But I will definitely bother those other scholars if
absolutely you should do that.
Okay.
I don't know Samantha personally, but I know Jenny, and she, I'm sure, would be delighted to talk to you about Rachel Bloom and Rebecca Bunch.
Awesome. On the literary front, though, there was a question in the list, and I don't, I'm pretty sure I told you I don't work my way through the questions.
Of course.
Usually, but there is, so when you talk about Judith as almost, and please let me know if I'm being reductive in this, as a representative figure for her people, my brain, I noticed, was going to things like allegory. Since this is a literary analysis of this text, could you tell me how I'm wrong? Because I really do think I'm wrong.
Okay. I think that you certainly could see the book as an allegory, and I think there have been people who have read it as an allegory, so I don't think it's a knee-jerk, well, you're wrong. There are a lot of aspects that do recommend that approach. There's a lot of parallels between the way that Judith is portrayed and the way that I think the author is trying to portray the nation of Israel. So, for example, Judith is chaste, right? She's not a virgin, but she's a chaste widow, and she is, her chastity is really important to the story. The fact that she is never really actually going to have sex with Holofernes is really, it's crucial to the story. So Judith's chastity, paralleled with the nation's chastity. Like this is a nation that cannot be violated. This is a city that's not going to be invaded, and I do think there is that parallel. Judith herself is just this exemplary character. I mean, she's kind of a little bit of a Mary Sue. She is pious, she's beautiful, she's worthy in every way, and the nation is similarly portrayed as just completely worthy. In a lot of biblical literature, the nation is portrayed as sinful or a wayward woman, wayward wife. But here, the nation is upright; it's worthy. Multiple characters declaim throughout the narrative that in their generation everybody is pious, everybody is worthy, nobody is worshiping idols, everybody is doing what they should be doing. So there is a parallel between Judith's righteousness and the righteousness of the nation. And then Judith is brave and clever. The nation is, has this bravery. The nation is going to, go out, and as soon as Holofernes' head is hanging on that wall, they're going to go out and attack his troops. So I mean, I think you certainly could see this as allegorical, but I don't want to take it so far that we read as only allegory, and I don't want to do that because I think that we risk then writing what I think is by far the strongest female character in biblical literature out of her own story. We don't want to do that. We don't want to just say like, okay, well, Judith is just, she's just a symbol. She is a symbol, but I don't think she's just a symbol. She's just this extraordinarily interesting and powerful character. I do think we can see parallels to other parts of biblical literature where women are symbols. And I do discuss that in the article as well, that you do sometimes have women as symbols in biblical literature. But what is different here is Judith represents her nation, but she's not abject. She's not sinful. Her sexual behavior is not being criticized. Like when we see Israel as a woman or woman as Israel in the prophetic literature, like in Jeremiah, Hosea, Ezekiel, we often see that woman as, her sexual behavior is questioned and she is seen as sinful or adulterous. And here, she's the exact opposite. So I think that's a really interesting turn, that you have all these places in biblical literature where you do have a woman, or somebody who's a city or a nation that's personified as female, and here we have that parallel, but it's actually a good one. It's actually a nice parallel, and that's something that is really unusual.
I think there's a kind of weird cynicism for us around stories right now, or at least pretty much for all of my life, that we've kind of followed a slope toward anti-heroes, and so a story about, there may be instances of faithlessness, the people are willing to give up, but Judith is acting on their behalf, and as you're saying, representative of them. And it's almost like, this is the only analog I can think of, and I'm sorry, I'm talking about a feminist, but I'm thinking immediately of Ted Lasso and what a relief it was to have a character where, yeah, there are flawed characters around him. He's not perfect himself, but there's a joy in seeing. No. There's beauty. There's beauty in the world and in humanity, but in this case, it's in Israel there is this faithfulness that she represents and ultimately wins the day. Is that? And again, I'm sorry for, I just can't think of something which is probably more telling about our culture's commitment to narratives, that there isn't like a female centered thing that points to that kind of joy like Ted Lasso does.
And now I'm realizing that I very much need to figure out a way to see Ted Lasso because I've never watched it before. But so I don't know. I don't know about the parallel that you're making. But yeah, I do think that this is true. We are there. There is a certain cynicism, and I'm a scholar, so I certainly fall prey to that as well. We interrogate everything. That's okay. But I do think that there is something kind of neat about this character. I mean, she really is just kind of I'm not saying that she's completely uncomplicated. You could do a lot. I mean, you could certainly complicate her character a lot. People have written, for example, about the figure of the maidservant, or really more accurately, the slave, the female slave who is not even named, and but whom she could not have actually accomplished this without, and who was just given complete short shrift. You could also do a lot with, ideals of violence and nationalism as they are portrayed in Judith. I don't want to portray this as a like completely kumbaya, problem-free, uncomplicated hero, because those are boring anyway. But but it is really interesting to me. I do think that it can be okay to be like, okay, this is a positive character, and not that she's unproblematic, because I don't think there's really such thing in biblical literature as unproblematic heroes and heroines for all sorts of reasons. But yeah, she is a hero. The author is quite enamored of her, and I think the audience is intended to be enamored of her as well. A lot of scholars have written about how they consider her pretty problematic as a feminist heroine. But honestly, I don't agree. I think there are ways that, I've written before about how I think that her very femininity, the way that she is using her womanhood, her performed widowhood, and her performed kind of seductress persona to get where she needs to go in the story and to accomplish the goal of the story, which is killing the general and saving her people. I've written before about how I think that this performed womanhood can even be read as parody a little bit. Like, these are the ideals that the patriarchal society has set for womanhood. Well, fine. I'm going to fulfill those ideals so much that it is going to verge into parody, or, the way I put it is basically she's in drag. She's in widow drag, or she's in sexy lady drag for, one or the other for basically the entire story. And so we can actually view what she's doing as possessing quite a bit of agency, and we can read her um, as maybe even mocking or subverting some of the patriarchal standards of womanhood, even as she is, as other feminist scholars have said, well, no, she's really just she's buying into it, and we don't want to push this character as a heroine, because she's just not. She's too she just buys into the domestic ideal of women, and at the end of the story, some folks say that she just disappears and just becomes domestic again, and she doesn't really take a leadership role. And I do challenge that, and I think that she's playing a role, and we can read this as a pretty conscious thing on the part of the character, even if it's not quite conscious on the part of the author.
But does she just become domestic again?
I don't think so. No. I mean, so the way that I see it at the end of the story, right? She goes and lives this quiet life in her house, and she refuses all of these proposals of marriage. And so some scholars have said, well, this is basically, she can't be reinscribed into the social order of her community because she's done this really transgressive thing. And so her remaining unmarried is just putting her back in her place and showing that she's not really suitable for being integrated back into society. But I see it really differently. I think that when she refuses marriage at the end of the story, if this character were to be married again, she would be somebody's wife. And as it is, she lives out the rest of her life on the land that her husband left her and the house that her husband left her, which is essentially now hers. She runs an estate. And I think within her context, this is the only way that she can actually remain an independent woman, is to not remarry and not have children. And I mean, that is the power move.
I got this feeling in my gut when you were referring to people saying she can't. It felt like counterfactual, like in history, like, well, this could have happened if that doesn't really seem like a helpful analysis. So I'm glad you said I don't think that that's I don't think that that's because I hate counterfactuals. like the author can only really communicate with the linguistic tools that are at their disposal, right? Like, so you, or conceptual tools. Is there a framework outside of married or unmarried? Like, what are the options that the
Right,
author
right,
had?
right. And I don't think it's realistic to expect that the author is going to have Judith, be the new town elder, right? Like that's not really in the vocabulary at this point, right? We've got the example pretty much of Deborah, and that's it from biblical literature. And yeah, I mean, the vocabulary is basically: Are you going to be married? And, is she going to remarry and have children, or is she not? And the answer is not. And I think it's so interesting how Judith is, she takes on this really what we might call like the mother of the people role. She, a few times in the story, is referring to the children of Israel like almost as if they are her children. um from whatever we can tell from the story, she does not have children. So she is this mother figure who is not a biological mother, but she takes on a mothering role. Broadly speaking, because she is essentially the savior of her people, the savior of her nation.
I think it's almost saying, to me anyway, as a 21st century American, there may be categories around symbolism or representation that we just don't have access to that could be there. Is that, does that make sense?
It's possible, yeah. I mean, I think that we do have to consider that our categories are not necessarily their categories, and that's why I do hesitate at sometimes the idea that we can fully recover things from the ancient world. It's complicated. And I think most historical critics working today would also, I think that gone are the days of absolutism and a quest to fully recover the historical fill in the blank. I think we're all a little bit, or most of us are a little bit more humble now. I like to think anyway. Um, but yeah, I think it's fair to say that we don't necessarily, our categories and their categories are certainly not necessarily the same.
Okay. Which, so I think feminism is a category that
Yes.
it's fair to say. So, feminist exegesis, which I don't know that I'd ever come across. That what is that? Can you explain what feminist exegesis is to me?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So feminist exegesis really is reading texts with the modern idea that women are people and the knowledge that women's voices and interests have often been suppressed, including in biblical literature. So for most of the Bible's history, the people who were reading, and not only reading but telling everybody else how to read, most of those people have been men. So whether that is the ancient rabbis, the church fathers, early biblical scholars in the 19th century, most of those people were dudes. So feminist exegesis, I think, offers a corrective to that. Both the fact that the texts themselves are more than likely mostly written by men, and the fact that the history of interpretation has mostly been male. So, feminist exegesis is often asking either what happens when a woman reads this text, or what happens when anyone of any gender reads this text with an idea toward recovering women's lives and stories and toward privileging women's lives and stories. And this can require asking a whole bunch of different questions of the text. And I don't even think that you have to have women in the text to be doing feminist exegesis. As Cheryl Exum points out in what I just always return to as this, phenomenal essay about basically how to do feminist criticism of the Bible. As she points out, like sometimes the question might be, oh, there's not a woman in this text. Why? We might expect there to be a woman in this text. Why is there not a woman in this text? And then, she suggests a whole bunch of other questions that I wind up using a lot. are there women here? If there are women here, are they named? If there are women here, do they speak at all? Because often we have female characters who just are silent, who don't speak. If there are female characters here in this text, when they do speak, are they speaking in line with what we might think their own interests are? Or are they speaking and acting contrary to their own interests? And if that's the case, why would that be? Are women interacting with one another? And if they interact with one another, what are those interactions, right? There have been several people who have proposed applying the Bechdel test to the Bible. Essentially, um, does the Bible pass the Bechdel test in that are there two female characters who are named who interact with one another, and when they interact, is it about something other than a man? And essentially, no, right? Like, even if you go to the book of Ruth, right, where you've got Ruth and Naomi who have this wonderful close relationship, almost all of the interactions that they have are about men. So we could play with that. We could play with the Bechdel test. We can do all sorts of other things. But basically, what I think it boils down to is looking at the Bible with this idea, of course, that women are people and that we need to try to recover some of the voices and some of the interests that maybe either were neglected in the original text or were neglected in the history of scholarship. What can we do with these blank spaces?
Sorry, there's a lot there, and I
yeah.
several threads.
Sure.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to figure out how to. Okay, so reading out of the text could mean there are no women here. Why? And trying to. So it's like going to the text, seeing, okay, there are no women here. Going back to the text to see, is there a reason why there are no women here? Or if there are, how are they communicating? What are they communicating? Is that kind of like a
Absolutely
dumbed down? Okay. What in the article have I not brought up yet? And I feel like there's a lot. So I'm asking this a few minutes earlier than I normally would.
Oh, that's a good question.
Or rather, the way I usually put it is, what were you hoping I would ask that I haven't asked yet?
Let's see. So this question about you had given me a question about some of the.
Is it number 9?
Yeah, it was number 9. Yeah, it was number 9. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
A word bomb. Okay, here. I think I can. So there are several different approaches to the book of Judith. And in some of them, they try interpreting Judith in a way that I think erases the Jewish nature of the book. And in other ways, other instances. So the first example would be like Reformation, Counter Reformation, and then this second one trying to of perverting the Jewishness of this narrative or of this character, which would be like I think the German play discussed by Zaragoza. So I mean, if you need to explain that, how do we see? And it can be within Jewish interpretation or within Christian interpretation. How do we see Jewishness in interpretation of Judith?
Right. So the play that you mentioned, so it is this anonymously written play from Germany in 1818. It's called Judith and Holofernes, and it is fascinating because it casts the Assyrians as the heroes and the Israelites as completely uncivilized and barbaric. And so, given the timing of this play and given the kinds of questions that are being asked post Enlightenment, there are all these questions in the 19th century about what's called Jewish emancipation. And the question is basically, can Jews be citizens of European nations? Are they fit for citizenship? Are they fit for all of the rights of and I'm doing massive scare quotes, normal read Christian inhabitants of these European places, right? These European nations. if they are not fit for citizenship, why is that? Is there something inherent, or is any lack of fitness or lack of class or um, you know lack of ability to assimilate? It could that be actually a result of being treated really poorly? This history of persecution. If people treat the Jews better, will they behave better? Right. So like this. It's called the Jewish question, and that's it's this thing. It's this question that's really going around in European society in the 19th century, post Enlightenment. The Jewish question: can Jews be productively integrated and granted citizenship rights? And so the person who writes this, Judith and Holofernes, in 1818 in Germany, is very clear on the answer to this question, and the answer is no. So in this interpretation, Judith is actually she is given a mission to kill Holofernes by the devil. She actually, in this one, she's not chaste. She has sex with Holofernes and kills him when his back is turned. So it is really like it's using the story of Judith as well, this treacherous Jew, right? She attacks the poor Assyrian, and so of course the author here is clearly seeing himself and his German Christian brethren as the poor persecuted Assyrians here, and they're persecuted and attacked by this treacherous and violent Jewish woman. So here the Belle Juive is this really like ugly and an awful figure. So the point of discussing this in the article was talking about how often the Belle Juive figure, and sometimes Judith herself as the Belle Juive, was sometimes used to make political points. And this is just this way. I mean, this is what we all do with the Bible, right? We all want to often read the Bible as we all want to insist that it's directly relevant to our time, right? We all want to read it in our own context. We want to, that there's this insistence on the Bible as timeless, but at the same time, also speaking directly to our own time. That is, I think, inherent to religious readings of Scripture. We can think about all those Renaissance paintings of biblical scenes where the characters are dressed as European lords and ladies. I always find those things so entertaining. But this is really something similar. This German author is really doing this, right? And really doing a violence to the story itself by doing kind of a thought exercise of, well, what if Judith is actually the villain? I'm not sure if that at all answers your question. I feel like it was a long question and it was a long answer, and I'm not sure if we've gotten anywhere.
It is. It's okay. A long question. No, it's a long question. Yeah. I think there are elements of the public and private in this story that like public power or identity or presence was a masculine thing. That was a male thing. That her not having that is what allowed her to get behind enemy lines in the first place, because she was not perceived to be a threat. And so there's a little bit of a subversion of like, well, she could only get where she got, because I'm not in any way validating the story of like anti-Jewishness, but it's already subversive to what a lot of people see as like, this is the natural order of how society goes, of how citizenship goes. And so someone whose brain is rotten with anti-Semitic ideas is probably going to grab a hold of this thing that's already subversive and say, yeah, see that they can't be trusted anywhere.
Exactly.
I'm so glad we're done with that. I'm so glad that nonsense doesn't exist in the world.
I do think that you're absolutely right that it is an incredibly subversive story. And, there are even people who have suggested that perhaps some of the reason that it doesn't make it into the canon is its very subversive nature. There's other reasons as well. possibly it's dating, when it was written, possibly its original language. We don't know its original language, but if it's not Hebrew or Aramaic, and it's Greek, nothing that's originally written in Greek makes it in. But its content could very well be part of it, and it's incredibly subversive. And Judith herself is she's a terrifying character if you're a guy, especially. So she is scary. She is subversive, and yeah, if you are going to make these connections, and if you've already got a lot of suspicion of Jews, which is kind of in the air in 19th century Germany. Yeah, I can see absolutely. You're completely right. You come down on, well, she must be in league with the devil. And then of course there's, centuries old stereotypes about conventions of portraying Jews as demonic. Anyway, so it just goes, it's a natural extension of things that were already there, that had been there for centuries. And then you enter in with this new question of the Jewish question and Jewish rights and Jewish emancipation. And it's this potent backdrop for a really, really anti-Jewish interpretation of the story.
Yeah. That's where should people go? That could be reading, listening, watching, to learn more about this subject, and that could just be anything, Judith related or around any of the topics that we've covered, or just anything that you think people would benefit from.
Oh gosh, that's a really good question.
Thank
so
you.
I didn't think about it. That's why it's a good question. So of course, I would not be a good academic if I didn't do blatant self-promotion of of my own book. So my book is called Women in Drag, Gender and Performance in the Hebrew Bible and Early Jewish Literature. And it was published in 2018. And I talk about Judith in there. And I also talk about Yael from the book of Judges. And then I also talk about this retelling of the story of Yael in the first century CE that clearly is very, very inspired by Judith. So it's these three separate stories, the two Yael stories and the Judith story. And I talk about how we can use queer theory and especially theories about drag and gender performance to read these stories and to read also the lack of reproduction, the lack of motherhood in all of these stories. So of course I I have to promote that. And let's see what else. I mean, there's some great stuff that people have written on the the Belle Juive in general. That let's see. I'm trying to like mine my own bibliography and see like what the best thing that I found was. Yeah, I did find there were a lot of really fantastic articles and books about the Belle Juive that I encountered. Work by Sander Gilman and Ulrika Brunot, and Olivia Bitten. I found all those really, really helpful. And, I was a little bit surprised to find all this stuff, because when this article came about because I was asked by a scholar friend to contribute to a session of Society of Biblical Literature that they were doing on race and ethnicity in the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. And they wanted me to do something on Judith. And I was like, okay, well, so obviously, really the question here is about gender and Jewishness, right? Like the book is literally, the name of the title character is Jewish woman, right? Jewess. It's got to be something on this topic. And so I started with trying to see what kinds of things have been written in critical race theory. I thought that would be the way to go. And, there has been some work in critical race theory done on anti-Semitism and Judaism and whiteness. And there is stuff on that. But what I found as I looked more into it was this Belle Juive stuff. It was something I'd heard about before, but, I'm a biblicist. It's, the pre-modern and that's not exactly my time period. So I was really excited to find all this literature on the Belle Juive and find that this was an incredibly well theorized figure. And I'm kind of now thinking about and wondering like what else we can do with biblical literature and this particular figure, right? Like there's some amazing work being done with critical race theory right now with biblical literature. Um, not by me, but by others. And I do wonder, maybe this this idea of the Belle Juive could also be really productive for other characters and other texts. But I'm not sure where I'm heading with that yet. For now, Judith.
That's okay, right? That's your job. You
Yeah, yeah.
ask questions and try to do. Actually, I don't even know that I think you guys feel like you're trying to answer the questions. I think you're just working on answering the questions. That's the sense I get. Am I wrong?
I think that's fair. One of my teachers in grad school, Doug Knight, he put it as you're kicking the ball down the soccer field a little more. And I liked that because I feel like it's a really humble and down to earth way of, most of us we're not changing the field, but we're trying to make a little progress. We're trying to ask some new questions. Maybe provide some glimmers of answers, or at least new suggestions of how to think about things. So I always really like that metaphor, the idea of just pushing the ball forward a little bit.
I think it certainly helps frame what your level of responsibility is, and it probably it probably helps establish expectations and maybe not feel quite so much pressure if all you can do is control your controllables. I know that's just an important thing for people. Oh, what do you read for fun?
What do I read for fun? Anything and everything. I just mostly fiction. I just finished reading a young adult novel called When the Angels Left the Old Country, about a pair of a Jewish angel and a Jewish demon who leave a small shtetl in Poland in the early 20th century to come to New York, and they're on a mission to save somebody else who had immigrated before them. And it's just this wonderful, like, very queer, friendly, very very Jewish, kind of adorable story about the love between this angel and this demon. And I don't know, I would recommend it. I thought it was pretty nice book.
That almost kind of sounds like the Golem and the Djinn. Have you heard of that?
Yes, yes,
Is
I
it like
love
that?
that book. Yes, it's a
Okay.
little bit like that. But definitely less R-rated, because it's
Okay.
supposedly for teenagers. But my husband saw it in the library, and he's like, "This just feels like your thing."
That's definitely
And yeah,
that's a thing that I've said to my wife. Like, oh,
yeah,
this color palette definitely works with, and
yeah,
she'll love it.
yeah.
Anything else?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I'm trying to think of what the last like really good book that I read was. Oh, you know what? I read a really fun novel last month called Zero Stars Do Not Recommend. Have you read this?
No.
Oh, it's fabulous. I don't want to spoil anything, but basically, a guy and his girlfriend go to the opening of a new resort, and they are hanging out on the beach when the sun explodes, and the resort gets taken over by a boss babe MLM, a multi-level marketing hun and her preacher husband, and a dystopian nightmare ensues. It was so fun.
Okay. Yeah. No. You've
Yeah,
got my
yeah.
attention.
It was really fun. Yeah,
It
I,
sounds
I really
fun.
enjoyed that. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Well, unless you have anything else for us, I'm going to call this one good. I could sit here and if okay, just based on those two book recommendations, I could listen to your book recommendations all day, but I don't want to eat up your time.
No, I appreciate it. If you have any book recommendations for me after now or after we're off air, I'm happy to take them. I'll read most things. As long as it's not like hard sci-fi, like aliens and spacemen and stuff, which is my husband's favorite. Like anything else, I'll read.
Well, I have a recommendation for him then.
Oh, good. Okay.
The Mercy of Gods.
Okay.
So it's the first book in a series that's just beginning. It's by the same guys who wrote The Expanse, also The
Hmm.
Expanse. If he hasn't read The Expanse, but it's aliens and all of that kind of stuff. So that's my recommendation for him because
All
I
right. I'm
recently
gonna
finished
recommend.
that.
I'm gonna convey that to him. I'm sure he'll appreciate that.
Okay. Well,
All
thank you
right.
so much for sitting down with me.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been fun.
Thank you so much for listening, and I appreciate you sticking around at the end here to hear a preview of my conversation with Brandon Hurlbert. You can hear Brandon on the Two Cities podcast if you want to look for him elsewhere. That is like on script podcast with a bunch of different hosts that rotate through the episodes, which is a pretty cool concept. And it seems even cooler the more time I sit here and just kind of do the podcast alone. So look for him there. And I hope you enjoy this clip. If you'd like to hear this conversation now, you can do so by clicking the link to the Patreon for the podcast and chipping in $5 a month. You'll hear episodes before they're released for free. And so, no more talking from me now. Here's the preview of my conversation with Brandon Hurlbert.
And by an anthology, I have in mind something like The Twilight Zone or maybe Black Mirror, if you are familiar with those shows, where there is kind of a collection of stories that can be read and appreciated and cherished or hated on their own terms, and yet they find a larger coherence because they are all situated within the same moral and literary universe. And so that's what can account for the kind of literary coherence or kind of shared themes throughout the text, word choices that are shared in various stories, but then also appreciate kind of the discontinuity between the stories or the differences in the way the narrator constructs a story or the themes that it's trying to present. And we can appreciate both the differences and the coherence, and we can do that by treating the text as an anthology.